The dog lunged the moment they wheeled him through the doors, not at the wall, not at the ceiling, at the nearest person in scrubs. Three staff members hit the floor. One nurse knocked over an entire medication cart. A tech from radiology didn't stop running until he reached the parking lot. And then, silence. Because the dog had stopped. Not because of the big male vet with the tranquilizer already loaded in his hand. Because of her. The tired woman in the stained scrubs nobody ever looked at twice. She hadn't moved a single inch. If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or written off, stay with me until the very end of this story. Hit that like button and drop the name of the city you're watching from in the comments. I want to see just how far this story travels. The first thing people noticed about Iron Gate Veterinary Medical Center was the smell. Not the antiseptic, though that was there too, sharp and medicinal, cutting through everything like a blade. It was something underneath that. Something older. The smell of animals carrying pain they couldn't name, of people making decisions they'd carry home with them for years. The waiting room on the ground floor absorbed it all. The low hum of fluorescent lights, the plastic chairs that had been the wrong color since 2009, the donated watercolor of a golden retriever that hung slightly crooked above the reception desk and had hung slightly crooked for so long that nobody on staff even saw it anymore. The emergency wing occupied the east side of the building, separated from the main clinic by a set of double doors that had a slow hydraulic hinge and a tendency to stick in cold weather. Harlow, Montana ran cold most of the year. The doors stuck constantly. It was a Tuesday in late October when everything changed, though nobody recognized it as that kind of day while it was happening. Days like that never announce themselves. They start ordinary. They start with the smell of bad coffee from the break room and a whiteboard schedule, and someone's half-eaten granola bar left on the counter for the fourth consecutive morning. Dr. Renata Voss had the morning shift and was already on her second argument with the billing department before 8 a.m. Marcus Webb, one of the senior technicians, had called in with what he described as a stomach situation that his coworkers understood meant a hangover. The intern from Montana State had shown up 17 minutes late with a coffee cup that said, "World's okayest person," and had apparently chosen not to see the irony. And Natalie Oakes was changing out a fluid line in exam room 3 when she heard the vehicles pull into the lot. She heard them before she saw them, which was how it always went with that kind of arrival. The particular engine sound of something heavy and American and not particularly concerned with blending in. She didn't look up immediately. She finished securing the drip line, checked the connection twice the way she always did, and then straightened up and rolled her shoulders back. Natalie was 31. She had the kind of face that didn't give much away. Blue-gray eyes that stayed level when things got loud, a jaw that sat slightly forward like she was always bracing for something, dark circles underneath that she'd stopped trying to conceal sometime around her 28th birthday. Her scrubs were the clinic's standard navy blue, and she'd already earned a streak of something rust-colored across the left sleeve that she hadn't had when she arrived. Her hair was pulled back in a way that was functional rather than neat. She moved through the clinic the way certain people move through crowded spaces. Not rushing, not dawdling, just covering ground with a quiet efficiency that most people didn't notice. That was the thing about Natalie Oakes. Most people didn't notice. She stepped into the corridor just as the double doors from intake swung open with more force than the hydraulic hinge was designed to handle. The man came through first. He was somewhere in his mid to late 30s, though he carried it like someone who had done a decade's worth of living inside a few compressed years. 6'2", maybe 6'3", built along lines that suggested utility rather than vanity. The kind of build that came from carrying weight, not from lifting it in controlled environments. He wore dark civilian clothes with a precision that read military even without a uniform, and he moved through the clinic doors the way people move through spaces they've already decided they own. Behind him, at the end of a thick tactical lead, came the dog. The shepherd was enormous, gray-black and lean and low to the ground in a way that suggested coiled intention rather than smallness. His ears were forward and hard. His eyes swept the corridor with a systematic thoroughness, left wall, right wall, ceiling, floor, faces, and landed on each of the 3 staff members in the hallway with the calm, cold assessment of something that knew exactly how fast it could cover distance. One of the front desk assistants, a woman named Jenny, who'd worked the clinic for 6 years, took a deliberate step backward without seeming to realize she'd done it. The shepherd's head swung toward the movement. A sound came from his chest. Not quite a growl, but the thing that comes before one. The structural warning, the "I have already decided" sound. "Bravo, station." The man's voice was flat and immediate. The dog stopped. Sat. But his eyes didn't move from Jenny. "We need emergency imaging," the man said to no one in particular and to everyone at the same time. "Left hindquarter, possible fracture. He's been favoring it for 2 weeks." Doctor. Voss appeared from the far end of the corridor, stethoscope around her neck, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She was a compact woman in her 50s with the efficient mannerisms of someone who ran a tight schedule and expected other people to match it. She took one look at the shepherd and stopped 3 feet short of her usual approach distance. "Can you tell me a little about his history?" "Combat K9, retired 14 months ago. His name's Bravo." The man said it the way people say things they're tired of explaining. "I'm Garrett Cole. I handled him for 6 years. And the limp started 2 weeks ago, gradually. He's not showing pain response in the traditional sense." A pause, measured. "He won't." Voss nodded slowly in the way that meant she was processing several things at once. "We'll want to get him into imaging, but I need to do a preliminary." "He doesn't let people touch him," Cole said it without apology. "He's fine with me. He'll tolerate the necessary contact for examination, but he doesn't—" He stopped himself, recalibrated. "You need to approach correctly or he will respond." "Respond meaning what he was trained to do." Voss looked at Marcus's empty station, then at the intern, who was examining a point on the wall with sudden, intense interest. Her gaze moved down the corridor. "Oaks?" She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Can you—" "Already here," Natalie said. She'd been standing 6 feet back along the corridor wall, not hiding, just not announcing herself, which was a different thing. She had a clipboard in one hand and had already pulled Bravo's intake form from the admissions stack with the other. Cole looked at her the way people look at someone they've categorized before fully processing. A nurse. Civilian. The stained scrubs, the unremarkable posture, the fact that she was a woman in her early 30s who did not look like someone who handled the situation he was presenting. His assessment took approximately 2 seconds and reached a conclusion that was visible in the brief reset of his expression. "He's not a regular dog," Cole said, directed at Voss, not at Natalie. "No," Natalie said. "He's not." Cole looked at her. A beat. I know." She was already looking at the dog. Bravo had not taken his eyes off her since she stepped into the corridor. That in itself was notable. The shepherd had been tracking the room in sweeping intervals since arrival, dividing attention the way trained dogs do, maintaining tactical awareness of every moving variable. He'd assessed Jenny, assessed Cole's position, assessed Voss, cataloged the intern as non-threat, and discarded him. But he kept coming back to Natalie. Not aggressively, not with the low-set calculation he'd aimed at Jenny. Something else. Something that looked, almost uncomfortably, like recognition. "We'll start with a manual assessment and go from there," Natalie said, setting the clipboard on the counter beside her. She kept her voice level and lower than her normal register. Not theatrical, not performative, just calibrated. An adjustment. "I said he doesn't allow. I heard you." She was already crouching, not moving toward Bravo, not making the mistake of a direct approach. She crouched against the corridor wall, sideways to the dog. Her eyes dropped slightly off-center so she wasn't meeting his gaze head-on. Her hands were loose at her sides. Cole started forward. "Do not—" Bravo stood up. Cole stopped. The shepherd took one step toward Natalie, then another, moving with the careful deliberateness of an animal managing pain it has learned not to broadcast. His back left leg compensated subtly, a micro-adjustment in weight distribution that most people in that corridor would not have clocked. Natalie had clocked it the moment he walked through the doors. Bravo stopped 2 feet from her. His nose dropped. He scented her wrist, then her forearm, then lifted his head and looked at her from approximately 18 inches away with those flat, intelligent eyes. Then he sat down next to her like she had asked him to. The corridor was very quiet. Cole's jaw had done something complicated. He stopped. His left hip is compensating. Natalie had one hand extended, palm up, letting Bravo make the decision. The shepherd pressed his muzzle briefly into her palm and then held still. He's been loading his right rear to protect it. See how he's sitting? The left haunch is elevated about 3 centimeters off his normal base. He's been doing that long enough that it's become habit, which means the injury is older than 2 weeks. Cole stared at her. How long has he been sleeping on the left side? She asked, looking up. A pause. I don't know. Check your memory on that one. I'd guess he shifted to preferential right side sleeping 6 to 8 weeks ago. Maybe more. She rose slowly, without sudden movement, and Bravo tracked her without alarm. He needs full hip imaging, both sides, for comparison, and I want blood panel before we touch him for anything procedural. She picked up the clipboard. I'll have intake. I'm not comfortable with just a nurse running this case. Cole's voice had an edge now. Not cruel exactly, but certain. The voice of a man accustomed to hierarchies and where he stood in them. No offense. I just need someone with more experience, Natalie said. She said it without inflection. No challenge in it, no defensiveness. Just the word, placed in front of him like an object he'd have to pick up or step around. Cole met her eyes. Credentials. Clinical authority. He's a retired military working dog. He's not a house pet. I'm aware. She handed the clipboard to Jenny, who had crept back to the desk. Dr. Voss will be primary physician on the case. I'm nursing support and handling coordination. She looked at Cole. Is that satisfactory? He didn't answer immediately. Bravo had leaned his shoulder against Natalie's left leg. Cole looked at his dog, then back at Natalie, and something moved behind his face that didn't quite resolve into an expression. Fine, he said, but I stay with him for any examination. That's standard protocol for trauma-bonded working animals, Natalie said. Not a problem. She turned and started down the corridor toward the imaging wing. Masit. The radiology suite at Iron Gate was small by urban hospital standards, designed for a facility that handled high volumes of small animal cases and moderate large animal emergency overflow from the farms in the surrounding county. The equipment was 2 generations old, but functional and well-maintained. The kind of machinery that works reliably because someone cares enough to keep it calibrated, not because it's new. Marcus would have handled the imaging setup on any other morning. In his absence, it fell to Natalie, which was not unusual. A lot of things fell to Natalie when other people weren't available, and she handled them the same way she handled everything, without making a production of it. What was unusual was the examination itself. Bravo tolerated the imaging room with the disciplined composure of an animal that had been through worse things than loud machines in confined spaces. He didn't love it. His body language communicated this clearly. The subtle tension across the shoulders, the elevated tail carriage, the way his breathing became controlled and deliberate rather than relaxed. But he held position when Natalie placed him, adjusted when she needed him to adjust, and looked at Cole for reassurance twice during the longer scan sequences in the way dogs look at the one person they've decided is their point of reference in an uncertain world. Cole stood in the corner with his arms crossed and said nothing, which was its own kind of language. Natalie moved around the table with the economical confidence of someone who has done physical work in high-stakes environments, not the smooth, polished choreography of the clinic's training videos, but the practical competence of a person who has learned to move correctly because wrong movements have consequences. There was a scar on her right forearm, partially visible below her sleeve. There was another one at the base of her throat, barely noticeable unless the light caught it at a specific angle. Cole noticed both. He noticed, she noticed him noticing, and said nothing about it. You've worked with military animals before, he said. It wasn't a question. Hand position is different for trauma-bonded working dogs, she said, adjusting the imaging angle. You learn to adjust. That's not an answer. I know. He watched her for a moment. Where'd you serve? She looked up from the equipment. I didn't say I served. You didn't have to. He said it without aggression, almost quiet. I know the posture, the way you scan a room when you enter, the way you positioned yourself in the corridor, not blocking the exit, not creating a pressure situation. A pause. Tactical awareness, you either learned it formally or you spent time around people who had it. Natalie held his gaze for exactly long enough. Let's see what the scans show, she said. Sa? They showed more than Cole was ready for. Natalie pulled the images up on the review monitor in the consultation room adjacent to radiology. Dr. Voss came in, took her reading glasses off her forehead, and put them on properly. The intern stood in the back of the room and looked like he wished he were somewhere else, which was fair. Cole stood directly in front of the screen. The hip joint was immediately, undeniably wrong. Not wrong in a subtle way. Not the kind of wrong that requires clinical expertise to identify. The kind of wrong that hits you in the chest when you look at it. The fracture plane running through the femoral neck like a fault line. The irregular bone remodeling around it that indicated the body had spent a long time trying to compensate for a structural failure it couldn't fix. Calcium deposits at the margins. The kind of periosteel reaction that radiologists date in months, not weeks. That's old, Cole said. His voice had changed. Yes, Voss confirmed. She pointed with her pen. The fracture here, the primary injury. This is not recent. The healing pattern suggests this occurred significantly prior to his retirement. The surrounding tissue changes, the remodeling, the scar calcification. She paused. I'd want a specialist to give you a formal timeline, but my clinical estimate would be this injury is 12 to 18 months old. Minimum. He retired 14 months ago. Yes. Cole stood very still. Bravo was sitting beside him, pressed against his leg. The shepherd had reoriented to Cole the moment they'd moved from the imaging suite to the consultation room. Recalibrated, back in his handler's gravity. But Cole's hand had dropped to the dog's head in a way that looked less like a handler's gesture and more like a drowning person finding something solid. He was cleared, Cole said. Before retirement. Full medical clearance. The words came out careful and controlled. I have the documentation. Natalie looked at Voss, a look that communicated something brief and specific. Voss removed her glasses. Mr. Cole, is it possible the clearance examination was performed by a contracted evaluator rather than your unit's primary veterinarian? Cole's face went through several things. The unit vet had rotated out. There was a transition period. The contracted team handled the transition assessments. He stopped. His jaw worked. You're telling me this was missed? I'm telling you, Voss said carefully, that this injury would be very difficult to miss in a thorough imaging examination. The room held that sentence for a moment. Which means it may not have been missed, Natalie said. Both Cole and Voss looked at her. She kept her eyes on the screen. A fracture with this level of remodeling. The body has been compensating for over a year. He was still performing during that period? Cole's voice was rough now. Yes, until the retirement assessment. And he passed every performance evaluation? He scored at the top of his class in every category up until Cole stopped. Because he was trained not to show pain, Natalie said. It wasn't an accusation. It was stated the way facts get stated when they're terrible and unavoidable. High-drive working animals, especially those with strong handler bonds, will mask pain responses that would incapacitate other animals. If an evaluator knew what to look for and chose not to look, she let the end of that sentence do its own work. Cole looked down at Bravo. The shepherd looked back up at him with the uncomplicated trust of an animal that has never once questioned the arrangement, even when the arrangement has failed him. He saved my life, Cole said quietly. Not to the room. Just to the fact of it, placed in the space between him and the dog. Twice. And I didn't... He stopped himself. His throat moved. I thought he was just getting older. Nobody said anything. After a moment, Cole pulled his posture back into its default configuration. Straight, controlled, the body language of a man who has practiced not coming apart in front of other people. What does he need now? Pain management first, Voss said. Surgical consultation. I'm going to refer you to an orthopedic specialist at the regional center. Depending on what they find, we're looking at potential hip repair or replacement and a significant rehabilitation period. She looked at him directly. He will not be able to continue any training protocols or physical work. His military career is over in every meaningful sense. regardless of the paperwork that processed his retirement. "I know," Cole said. And he did. "What else?" "Rest, controlled movement, no stairs, no running, no impact surfaces." Voss hesitated. "He's been in pain for over a year, significant chronic pain that he has been trained to absorb. The relief from proper treatment is going to be—" She searched for the word. "Considerable. He's going to need time to learn what it feels like not to hurt." Cole absorbed this with the stillness of someone receiving news they partially already knew and had been refusing to fully hold. Natalie had moved to the counter along the side wall and was preparing the initial pain management protocol, pulling dosage references, checking Bravo's weight from the intake form, calculating, methodical, not making it a performance, just doing the next thing that needed doing. Cole watched her. "Oaks?" he said. She looked up. "What happened to your forearm?" Natalie looked at the scar, a reflex, checking which one he meant, the old automatic assessment. Then she looked back at him. "Same thing that happened to a lot of people in places you probably know the names of," she said. And then, "Ready for his first dose. Come hold him for me." Well, Bravo took the pain management injection with the stoic dignity of an animal that had learned long ago that needles were part of the deal. He held still with Cole's hand on his collar and Natalie's voice dropping into that low-level register again. Not baby talk, nothing soft or condescending, just a quiet and consistent verbal anchor. And when it was done, he exhaled slowly through his nose and leaned into Cole's knee. They were setting Bravo up in one of the recovery observation kennels, the larger one at the end of the row that they kept for critical cases, when the phone at the nursing station rang. The intern answered it, listened for approximately 4 seconds, and then stood up very straight. He walked to the doorway of the kennel room. His face had done something strange. "Natalie," he said, "there's someone at the front desk. He stopped, tried again. "They're asking for you by name, and they said—" He looked down at the notepad in his hand like he was checking whether he'd written it down correctly. "They said to tell you that Captain Wren's team is in the building." Natalie went very still. She had been adjusting the kennel latch. Her hand stopped moving. Her back was to the room, and nobody could see her face for a moment, which was perhaps fortunate. Cole had looked up from Bravo. He was watching her. "Who is Captain Wren?" he asked. Natalie took one breath, slow, even, the kind of breath that people take when they need to put something away quickly before they turn around. She turned around. Her face was composed, fully composed, the blue-gray eyes level, the jaw set in its default forward position. But something had shifted underneath all of it, something subtle enough that most people in that room wouldn't catch it. Cole caught it. He caught it the same way Bravo had caught her posture in the corridor, with the pattern recognition of someone trained to notice what other people were trained to hide. "I'll handle the front desk," Natalie said. "Natalie," Cole stood up. "Who is Captain Wren?" She looked at him for exactly 1 second. "Someone I used to work with," she said, and she walked out of the kennel room, and her footsteps in the corridor were even and unhurried, and she did not look back. Behind her, in the kennel, Bravo lifted his head and watched the doorway she'd passed through. Cole stared after her. Something cold moved through him that had nothing to do with the temperature. He'd been in enough situations where information arrived in pieces to know what the arrival of a piece of information felt like. That moment in the consultation room when you realized the briefing you'd been given was missing something important. That particular quality of a room right before something irreversible happened. He knew that feeling. It was in this room right now. He looked at the intern, who was still holding his notepad and looking like he'd stumbled into something he didn't have the context to understand. "Stay with him," Cole said, and he followed Natalie down the corridor. He heard them before he reached the front reception area. Not words, voices. Multiple, low, clipped. The particular cadence of people accustomed to conducting conversations that shouldn't carry. He pushed through the double doors. There were 4 of them. Military, not in uniform, but unmistakably so. 2 men, 2 women, all in civilian clothes that wore them like a cover story. One of the women was holding a folder with a federal insignia that Cole's brain identified before his eyes had finished processing the room. Natalie was standing in front of them. She was not standing the way she'd been standing all morning. The slightly forward-tucked posture of the working nurse, the functional civilian stance. She was standing differently, straight in a way that was specific, recognizable. The posture of someone returning to a default setting they thought they'd left behind. The woman with the folder was speaking quietly. Natalie was listening. Her arms were at her sides. Cole stopped in the doorway. One of the male agents, because that's what they were, Cole now understood that's what they were, clocked Cole's entrance and looked at the woman with the folder. A small, silent exchange. The woman stopped speaking. She looked at Natalie. Natalie turned around. When she saw Cole standing in the doorway, something crossed her face that she didn't quite manage to suppress in time. Not embarrassment, not guilt. Something older than either of those things. "Cole," she said, "you should go back with Bravo." "Who are these people?" The woman with the folder looked at Cole steadily. Then she looked at Natalie with the expression of someone waiting for a decision to be made. Natalie held Cole's gaze for a moment. Then she said, "Give me 10 minutes. And the way she said it, the authority in it, the unconscious command weight that dropped into those 4 words, made Jenny behind the reception desk look up from her computer with sudden attention. Made Cole's chest do something complicated, because he'd heard people speak that way his entire adult life. He'd spoken that way himself. And the people who spoke like that didn't learn it in nursing school. They learned it in places where the cost of unclear communication was measured in something other than paperwork. Natalie turned back to the agents. The woman with the folder opened it, and Cole stood in the doorway, and Bravo was down the corridor behind him, and the October cold was pushing through the gap in the clinic's front door, and something was happening in this room that was several sizes larger than anything the morning had appeared to contain. The folder contained photographs. Cole couldn't see them from the doorway. The angle was wrong, and the woman holding it had shifted her body in a way that was either deliberate or had become second nature through years of doing exactly this kind of thing in exactly this kind of space. But he could see Natalie's face as she looked at them, and that was enough. She didn't flinch, didn't react with the visible shock of someone encountering something unexpected. She looked at each photograph with the concentrated stillness of someone confirming information they had already partially possessed, assembling pieces they'd been carrying separately into a shape they could now see whole. That was worse, somehow, than if she'd flinched. Cole stepped fully into the reception area. The male agent nearest the door moved, not blocking, not exactly, but repositioning in a way that communicated preference. "Sir," his voice was professionally flat. "This is an ongoing, I know what it is," Cole said. He looked past the agent at Natalie. 10 minutes was your number. I'm staying in the room." A beat. Nobody spoke. Then Natalie said, without looking up from the folder, "Let him stay." The agent stepped back. Not happy about it, but compliant. Natalie turned the last photograph over and closed the folder herself, a gesture the woman hadn't offered, but didn't protest. She handed it back. Squared her shoulders. Not the theatrical kind of squaring, just the small internal adjustment of someone taking on weight and redistributing it. "When?" Natalie asked. "Evidence formally submitted to the investigative board 48 hours ago," the woman said. Her name, Cole would later learn, was Harker. She had the contained effect of someone who delivered difficult information regularly enough that she'd developed a system for it. The timeline suggests active concealment going back approximately 22 months. "Who's the lead on the investigation?" "Donahue, out of the regional compliance office." A pause. "He asked for you specifically." Something moved across Natalie's face. "Donahue knows where I am?" "We know where everyone is," Harker said. Not unkindly. Natalie was quiet for a moment. Jenny had stopped pretending to work at the front desk, which was understandable. There was nothing in her job description that covered this particular situation, and the pretense had become difficult to maintain. "What do you need from me right now?" Natalie asked. "Your records. Anything you documented during the transition assessment period. Treatment logs, evaluation notes, anything that went through your hands before you separated." Harker held the pause for exactly the right length of time. "And a formal statement, preferably today." Cole had been watching Natalie's profile. He watched the small muscle at her jaw work once and stop. "I'll need to arrange coverage for my shift," she said. "Of course. She turned then and found Cole still standing 3 feet behind her, which she clearly had not forgotten, but may have hoped he'd have the decency to appear to have forgotten. She looked at him with the expression of someone making a rapid calculation about how much damage control was available and what form it should take. She chose directness. He'd already suspected she would. "I need to make a call," she said, "and then I'll explain what I can." "What you can?" "What I can," she repeated. Even. Unapologetic. Cole's jaw tightened. He looked at Harker, then back at Natalie. "Is Bravo connected to whatever this is?" The way Natalie went still answered him before she did. "I don't know yet," she said. And there was something in how she said it, the careful precision of it, the way she chose "don't know yet" instead of "no," that made Cole's blood run several degrees cooler. Dr. Voss took the news that Natalie needed to step away from the rest of her shift with the practical resignation of someone who had long since stopped expecting Tuesday to behave itself. She pulled Marcus Webb off his supposed sick day with a phone call that lasted approximately 45 seconds and contained very little sympathy, covered the remaining critical cases herself, and told the intern to stay visible and do nothing unsupervised in that order. Natalie made her call from the small supply corridor off the main nursing station, the one with the broken overhead light that nobody had gotten around to replacing, which meant it ran on the ambient glow from the hallway and suited certain kinds of conversations better than fully lit rooms. Cole stood near the end of that hallway, not close enough to hear, close enough that she knew he was there. She called a number she didn't keep in her contacts. She had it in her head, the way you carry numbers you can't afford to lose and can't afford to have found. The call lasted 4 minutes. She didn't say much on her end, mostly listened, asked 2 specific questions, got answers she stood very still for, and ended it cleanly. When she came out of the supply corridor, Cole was where she'd expected him to be. "Walk with me," she said. They went back to the observation kennel room where Bravo was resting. The large kennel at the end of the row, the door latched but not locked. The shepherd lifted his head when they came in, assessed the room, put his head back down with the careful deliberateness of an animal newly introduced to something that might be the beginning of pain relief, the strange, suspicious loosening that comes when the body cautiously starts believing it might be allowed to stop fighting. Natalie pulled a stool from the corner and sat down. Not performing composure, just sitting down because she needed to. Cole stood. "His evaluation," she said, 14 months ago. "The transition assessment. Do you remember who ran it?" "Contracted team, I told you. There was a gap in unit coverage." "The contractor's name, do you remember it?" Cole thought. "Harwick, some company out of..." He stopped. His expression changed. "Vantage Assessment Group. Harwick was their lead evaluator." Natalie looked at her hands. "Harwick is one of the names in that folder." The observation room was quiet except for Bravo's breathing and the low mechanical hum of the kennel's ventilation system. "Tell me what's going on," Cole said. His voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it that wasn't. He'd spent a lot of years training himself not to lead with that something, but it was there. Natalie took a breath, organized it. "Before I came here," she said, "I worked military trauma, human and canine. Medical support during forward operations, then transition into rehabilitation work for injured working animals before they were processed out. Combat canine recovery. The period before retirement, when the dogs go through the assessment chain that determines their medical status, their placement, their care protocols going forward." She paused. "I was part of that chain for about 3 years." Cole was listening with the absolute quality of attention that people who operate in dangerous environments develop. Not just hearing, but absorbing, filing, assembling. "Harwick's group was brought in during a high-volume retirement cycle," Natalie continued. "There were more animals being processed out than the standard unit vets could handle. Vantage Assessment Group had a contract, credentials, the right paperwork. They ran evaluations for somewhere in the range of 63 animals over an 18-month period." She looked up at Cole. "I flagged 3 cases. Animals I'd worked with in recovery who came through Vantage's assessment chain with clearances that didn't match my clinical observations. Hip integrity, spinal compression, one case of a developing neurological issue that got marked as resolved. She stopped. I submitted formal documentation. My unit supervisor reviewed it, and it was determined that my concerns were noted and that the contractor's certifications were sufficient. Noted and buried, Cole said. I didn't have proof then. I had clinical observation and 3 files where the numbers didn't match what I'd seen with my hands. Her voice stayed even. 6 months later, I separated. You left because of this. I left because a lot of things had accumulated. She said it in a way that didn't invite follow-up questions on that particular point, and Cole didn't push it. But yes, this was part of it. Cole looked at Bravo. The shepherd's flank was rising and falling in the slow rhythm of something that might, for the first time in over a year, be approaching genuine rest. The pain medication was doing what it was supposed to do, something that should have happened 14 months ago. So Harwick's group cleared animals with existing injuries, Cole said. Animals that should have been flagged for treatment before retirement, before placement. They signed off on medical status that was either negligently wrong or deliberately falsified, Natalie said. The investigation will determine which. A beat. But the remodeling in Bravo's hip, the pattern Voss showed you, that level of skeletal change doesn't happen quietly. You don't miss it if you're looking. An evaluator doing a thorough imaging review of a working animal would see that. She met Cole's eyes. If they were looking. Cole sat down on the floor. Not dramatically, just the simple downward movement of someone whose legs have decided to negotiate. He sat with his back against the kennel wall and his forearms on his knees and looked at the middle distance. Bravo lifted his head, assessed, shifted carefully onto his better hip, and leaned in the direction of Cole's voice even from inside the kennel, that old gravitational pull that years of partnership create between a dog and the one person they've fully decided is their anchor point. He was in pain, Cole said, for the entire time he was with me after retirement, in my apartment, on my couch. When I thought he was just slowing down, getting older, that he'd earned the rest, he stopped. His jaw was doing what it had done in the consultation room, working through something that didn't have a clean exit. He was hurting every day. He didn't show it because he was trained not to, Natalie said, and because he was with you. High-drive animals and strong handler bonds will mask pain more intensely with their person than with strangers. There's a protection component to it. He was keeping it together for you. Cole put a hand over his face. He left it there for a moment. Natalie didn't say anything. She didn't offer the things people usually offer in these moments. The "it's not your fault," the "you couldn't have known." She sat with the information and let him sit with it too, which was a different kind of respect. After a while, Cole lowered his hand. "What happens now?" he asked. His voice was back to its operational register, but something in the texture of it had shifted, rougher at the edges. "The investigation team needs my statement and whatever documentation I retained from the flagged cases 3 years ago." She paused. "And Bravo's scans, with Voss's clinical dating, are now evidence. This clinic is going to receive a formal evidence preservation request, probably by end of day. And Harwick?" Natalie looked at him steadily. "That depends on what the documentation shows. If the falsification is as systematic as the preliminary evidence suggests," she stopped herself from finishing that particular sentence the way she'd intended to finish it. "It won't be civil." Cole absorbed this. His expression was doing the thing it did when he was processing something that had implications in multiple directions simultaneously. The particular flatness of a person running scenarios. "How many dogs?" he asked. "Total, not just your 3. If Vantage ran 63 evaluations and this is a pattern, the investigation will determine that." "How many, Natalie?" She looked at him for a long moment. "Possibly all of them," she said quietly. The room received this. 63 animals. 63 retired working dogs, placed in homes and foster programs and secondary service roles, carrying injuries that may have been signed off on by evaluators who knew what they were signing off on. 63 handlers who had trusted a process designed to ensure the animals that had worked alongside them were given what they'd earned. Cole looked at the ceiling. Bravo made a small sound, not distressed, just checking, and Cole dropped his gaze and said quietly, "Easy, buddy." and the shepherd settled. Harker and her team set up in the small conference room that Irongate used for staff meetings and occasional client consultations. It was not designed for federal-adjacent investigative work, which meant they were using a table with a wobble on the left side and chairs in 3 different styles that the clinic had accumulated across a decade of replacements. But nobody commented on this. Natalie sat across from Harker with a yellow legal pad that she'd pulled from the supply cabinet. The same supply cabinet she'd pulled medication references from an hour earlier in what felt like a different version of this morning. She'd called the number she had memorized and confirmed that the documentation she'd retained from 3 years ago was accessible. She'd kept copies of her flagged case reports, her submission records, and the response documentation from her unit supervisor. She'd kept them the way certain people keep certain things. Not because they knew they'd need them, not exactly, but because some part of the pattern recognition apparatus that keeps people alive in complicated situations had decided that discarding them would be a mistake. That same apparatus had turned out to be right. She walked Harker through the timeline methodically. The 3 flagged cases, the animals' names, their service histories, their identifying information, the dates of the Vantage evaluations, and the dates of her own clinical observations. The specific discrepancies, not her interpretation, just the measurements, the imaging comparisons, the observable physical markers that had not matched the assessment conclusions. Harker had a recorder running, a second agent taking handwritten notes, and the expression of someone who had spent enough time in this work to have learned not to telegraph reaction. But twice during Natalie's account, she glanced at her note-taking colleague with a look that Natalie recognized as the look of a person who is confirming that what they are hearing is as significant as they thought it was. Cole was in the hallway. He'd tried to come in, and Harker had redirected him politely but firmly, and he was now occupying the hall outside the conference room with the focused, coiled stillness of a person who has been asked to wait and is profoundly bad at it. When Natalie came out an hour and 20 minutes later, he was still there. He'd been there the whole time. She could tell by the way he was standing, the same controlled tension from when she'd gone in. He hadn't gone back to the kennel room. He'd stayed. She didn't know what to do with that exactly, so she put it aside for the moment. They need Voss to make the imaging records formally available, she said. Evidence hold. I'll walk you through what happens to Bravo's case practically. It doesn't change his treatment protocol. The scans just become part of a legal chain of custody. I understood the first time, Cole said. He was looking at her with something that was more complex than anger, though there was anger in the mix. Why didn't you push harder? 3 years ago, when you filed and they buried it, why didn't you go outside the chain? It was a fair question. It was also a question that assumed certain things about how the world worked that Natalie had spent 3 years recalibrating her understanding of. I was 28, she said. I was a nurse specialist 3 years out of my initial deployment posting. I had clinical observation notes and the documentation of 3 cases, and the contractor had a federal certification and the signatures of 4 senior officers on their contract. She held his gaze. I would have been managing a complaints process against a federally contracted assessor with the backing of exactly 0 institutional support, and I had... She stopped, started again differently. I had other things happening. I made the choice to leave. I thought the documentation would stay buried. But you kept it. But I kept it, she said. Cole studied her for a moment. That assessing quality again, not unkind, just thorough. You've been waiting for it to surface. I've been hoping it would surface, she corrected, with a precision that was its own kind of admission. There's a difference. He nodded slowly. Something in his posture shifted. Not softening exactly, but recalibrating. The adjustment of a person who has received new information and is integrating it into the existing structure. The woman in that room, he said, the one who kept 3 years of documentation and memorized a phone number she couldn't afford to write down. He paused. That's not someone who just happened to be working in a veterinary clinic in Harlow, Montana. People land in places, Natalie said. Not people like you, not randomly. He said it without pressure, just observation. What are you doing here, Natalie? She was quiet for a moment. Bravo needs his afternoon vitals checked, she said. And she walked back down the corridor toward the kennel room, and Cole stood in the hallway for a moment before following her, because that was apparently what this day was going to consist of. By mid-afternoon, the clinic had developed the particular charged atmosphere of a place where something large is happening in one part of the building while the rest of it tries to continue operating normally. The regular appointment schedule had proceeded. A spaniel with a recurring ear infection, 2 cats for annual vaccines, a farmer from outside town with a border collie that had gotten into a wire fence, and the front desk staff and the exam room technicians had maintained professional function while also processing the presence of federal agents in their conference room with varying degrees of success. Jenny had made 3 unnecessary trips past the conference room hallway. The intern had finally done something useful by volunteering to cover kennel rounds, which kept him occupied and out of the way. Doctor. Voss had signed the evidence preservation paperwork with the same brisk efficiency she brought to everything and then gone back to her afternoon appointments, because the clinic did not stop for investigations any more than it stopped for anything else. Natalie had been in and out of the kennel room 4 times. Bravo's vitals were stabilizing well. The initial pain management was doing its job. His breathing had settled, and he was demonstrating the cautious, experimental quality of an animal that is starting to understand that the source of the constant background pressure in its body is being addressed. He wasn't relaxed yet. Trust in new physical states takes time to build, but he was beginning to investigate the possibility. She was adjusting his water access when Cole came in and sat down on the floor in the same spot he'd occupied before. "Marcus Webb is back," he said. "The big technician. He keeps looking at the conference room." "He does that when things are outside his control," Natalie said. "He'll settle down." "Does he know what's happening?" "He knows there are investigators in the building and that it's related to my prior service. That's all anyone on staff knows." She closed the kennel door, not all the way, just enough, and leaned against the adjacent kennel. "Voss knows more because she's the primary physician, and the evidence request required her direct involvement. She won't talk." Cole looked at Bravo. The shepherd was watching him with half-lidded eyes, the drowsy alertness of an animal that is tired but not willing to fully surrender consciousness. Still monitoring, still doing the job at some base level, even when the body was finally starting to let go. "I want to be part of the statement," Cole said. "My observations of Bravo's decline, the timeline, the performance evaluations that passed him, all of it is material evidence." "I know. Harker will want to talk to you. I'd planned to tell you that." "You'd planned to tell me." "I've been managing a few things simultaneously," she said, without apology, but also without edge. He almost smiled. It was a small, not entirely comfortable thing, but it was there. Fair. They stayed like that for a moment. Him on the floor, her against the kennel, Bravo between them in the drowsy, careful process of beginning to rest, with the particular quality of quiet that settles between 2 people who have been moving through an intense situation together and have arrived at a momentary pocket of stillness. "You were good at it," Cole said. "The combat K9 work, I can tell." "I was decent at it." "Titan." He caught himself, readjusted. "Bravo. He trusted you in under 3 minutes. That dog doesn't trust anyone under 3 years." He looked at her directly. "Decent is the wrong word." Natalie looked at the floor. "I was good at the work," she said, in a way that suggested the rest of that sentence was more complicated. "The work itself." Cole waited because he'd learned to read the cadence of what she left out. "I wasn't good at the system around the work," she said finally. "The chain, the institutional, but the way things were supposed to happen, and the gap between that and how they actually happened." She exhaled slowly. "I kept thinking the system would correct, that if I documented correctly, submitted through the right channels, followed the protocol." She stopped. "Protocol assumes the people enforcing it want the same outcome you do. That's not always a safe assumption." "No," Cole said. "It isn't. I know that now in a way I didn't know it at 28. She glanced at him. "Is that growth or just damage? I've never been sure." "Could be both," he said. "Usually is." She nodded slowly. The honest, unlabored quality of someone receiving an answer that fits. Bravo's breathing had deepened. He had, finally and fully, fallen asleep. The heavy, total sleep of an animal that has been white-knuckling through pain for so long that the moment the pain recedes, the body takes what it's owed without negotiation. Cole looked at his dog sleeping, and his expression did the thing it had done a few times throughout the day. That opening up, that exposure, the cracks in the operational facade, where something real and not particularly controlled showed through. He would have kept going, Cole said quietly. Until he couldn't. He would have... He stopped. That's the thing about them. They never stop. You have to stop them, and to stop them, you have to know it's time, and knowing it's time requires them to tell you, and they don't. They don't, Natalie agreed. That's why the people around them have to pay attention. She paused. You brought him in. 2 weeks in, you noticed something was wrong even though he wasn't showing you, and you brought him in. A lot of handlers don't. I should have noticed sooner. Probably. So should the system that was supposed to catch it before you had the chance to notice or not notice. She met his eyes when he looked up. The failure was not yours alone, not even mostly yours. He held her gaze. Something moved through his expression, something that wasn't agreement quite, but was adjacent to it. The beginning of allowing a different accounting of things. The conference room door opened down the hall. Both of them heard it. The sound of multiple footsteps, the particular density of sound that indicated movement with purpose. Harker's voice, low but carrying, "Get Donahue on the line, now." And under that, another voice, male, clipped, a single sentence that came through the wall with the clarity of words spoken with no care for who heard them. Natalie came off the kennel wall in one smooth movement. Every degree of looseness she'd allowed herself in the last half hour was gone. Cole was already on his feet. What did they find? She was already moving toward the door. Natalie, he followed. What was that? She pushed through the kennel room door into the corridor. Parker was standing at the far end with her phone to her ear, and two of her agents flanking her with the body language of people who have just received information that has upgraded the urgency level of everything they're doing. The second male agent, the note-taker, was at the supply corridor with a laptop open. He'd pulled up something. Cole could see the glow of a screen, multiple windows, a document with column formatting that looked like records. Parker ended her call. She looked at Natalie. We've been pulling the Vantage Assessment Group records, she said. Full client roster for the 18-month contract period, cross-referenced against current placement status of the evaluated animals. She paused. 11 of the 63 have died in the past 14 months, post-retirement. 3 of those deaths involved euthanasia decisions made by placement families or secondary handlers due to mobility failure and unmanageable pain. She paused again. The placement families were told the animals had passed standard medical evaluation. The corridor was very still. Natalie stood in it with her face doing absolutely nothing. That complete composure that Cole had seen her deploy before. The discipline of a person who has learned to process impact internally rather than externally because external processing was not safe or useful in the environment she'd worked in. 3 dead dogs. 3 placement families who had watched animals they'd taken in on the promise of a clean bill of health deteriorate and fail. 3 euthanasia decisions made with incomplete information. 48 still placed in homes and programs with no idea what their animals might be carrying. 11 total gone. 14 months. Harwick, Natalie said. One word. Her voice was completely level. His primary office has been contacted, Harker said. Federal investigators are en route. A pause. He is currently not at that location. Cole went very still. Natalie looked at Harker. What do you mean he's not at the location? His office staff says he left this morning, approximately 4 hours ago. Harker's eyes were steady, giving Natalie exactly the information she was giving her and watching the processing in real time. His phone is off. His vehicle is at the office. No current whereabouts. The hallway held this. Cole's hand had dropped to his side where, in a different version of his life, something else would have been. Natalie turned and looked at the far wall for a moment. Just the wall, bare drywall, with a faded informational poster about canine heartworm prevention, something to focus on while she ran through what this meant and what it implied and what came next. Her jaw was set. Her breathing was controlled. But her hands, hanging at her sides, had closed into loose fists. He knows, she said. Someone told him. That's one possibility, Harker said. That's the only possibility, Natalie said. and the flatness of her certainty was its own kind of statement about how many times she had been through a version of this. Information moved through channels, someone warned, the accountability rerouted before it could arrive. He had 4 hours. We have protocols. Your protocols assumed you had a contained situation. She turned back to Harker. Who else is on the Vantage roster? Not just Harwick. He ran the evaluations, but he didn't run the contracting. Who signed the original agreement? Who approved payment continuation after my formal complaint was filed and not actioned? Harker looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone reevaluating the person they're looking at. That's the line of inquiry we're pursuing, she said. That's the line of inquiry you need to run fast, Natalie said. Because if Harwick had 4 hours and a warning and a vehicle he chose not to take, he's either already in a car someone else drove or he had a contingency that didn't involve his primary vehicle. Either way, he didn't panic. People who don't panic have plans. She paused. He's done this before. Something shifted in Harker's posture, subtle, but there. The recalibration of someone receiving strategic intelligence from a source they hadn't fully valued until this moment. Oaks, Harker said. She said it like a different kind of sentence than the one she'd been using all day. I know, Natalie said. Cole was watching her. He was watching the way the room had shifted around her, the way Harker's 2 agents had subtly reoriented, not toward Harker, but toward Natalie, the way people reorient toward the person who has just become the most operationally useful person in the space. He had seen this happen before, in different rooms, with different stakes. He knew what it looked like when someone stopped being background. He'd known what Natalie was since the moment Bravo put his head on her knee. He'd been waiting for everyone else to catch up. Harker pulled her phone out again. I need to make a call. Natalie, I need you available for the next... The clinic's front desk phone rang. They all heard it. Jenny's voice, professional and careful, saying, Iron Gate Veterinary, how can I help you? A pause. Then Jenny's voice again, and this time there was something different in it. Not panic, not drama, but the controlled tightness of a person choosing their words carefully because something about the call has told her to. One moment, please. Let me see if she's available. She appeared at the end of the corridor. She looked at Natalie with the expression of someone carrying a message they don't fully understand and are trying to deliver accurately. There's someone asking for you, Jenny said. He says... She glanced at the paper in her hand where she'd written it down. He says to tell you that you still have his documentation and that you should reconsider making it available. Nobody moved. He says his name is Harwick. Nobody moved for exactly 2 seconds. Then Harker's hand came up, a flat, open gesture directed at her agents, and the room reorganized itself without a word being spoken. One agent went to the front window. The other pulled his phone and stepped toward the conference room. Harker herself crossed the corridor in 4 strides and stopped in front of Jenny, who was holding the slip of paper with Harwick's message on it, like it had developed an unpleasant texture. Is he still on the line? Harker asked. He said he'd call back in 5 minutes. Jenny's voice was steady, which took something. He didn't give me a chance to respond. He just said it and disconnected. Harker looked at Natalie. Natalie was already thinking. Cole could see it. The quality of her stillness had changed from the stillness of someone absorbing a shock to the stillness of someone running a calculation. Different kind of motionless. Different kind of weight behind the eyes. He's not running, Natalie said. No, Harker agreed. He left his office before we made contact, but he's calling the clinic directly. He knows exactly where the investigation is centered. She looked at the front desk phone, then at Harker. He's not scared. He's negotiating. He thinks he has leverage. He thinks I'm his leverage. She said it without drama, just placing the fact where it needed to be. The documentation I retained, my flagged case files, the submission records, the response trail from my unit supervisor. He's had 3 years to wonder whether I kept copies. Now he knows the investigation is active, and he's assuming I'm the origin point. She paused. He wants me to decide the documentation isn't worth what it costs me. What does he think it cost you? Cole asked. Natalie looked at him, a beat that contained something she chose not to unpack in the middle of a corridor with 3 federal agents and Jenny from the front desk in the room. Prior service details, she said. Things adjacent to the flagged cases that didn't make it into my formal submission because they weren't directly material to the animal welfare issue. She held Cole's gaze with the steady quality of someone being precisely as transparent as the situation requires. He knows things about the operational context I was working in. He's betting that I don't want those details in a federal record. Are they criminal? Harker asked. No. Flat. Immediate. But they're complicated. And complication in a federal investigation creates friction and delay and the kind of attention that makes people who have been living quietly in Harlow, Montana, very visible in ways they've spent 3 years avoiding. Cole looked at her. She didn't look back. Harker was already recalculating. If he calls back, when he calls back, Natalie said. When he calls back, we need the call traced, and we need him talking long enough for location acquisition. That means someone he trusts on the line, or someone he thinks he's winning against. She looked at Natalie with the direct clinical assessment of someone making a personnel decision. Can you do that? Yes, Natalie said. No hesitation, no qualification. He's going to push on the documentation. I know. He's going to imply consequences. I know. Her voice hadn't changed register once. Set up the trace. Tell me when you're ready. The trace equipment was not glamorous. Harker's team had a portable unit in the vehicle outside, the kind of setup that looked less like television and more like someone's overworked laptop connected to a box with too many cables. And getting it integrated with Iron Gate's phone system required 12 minutes and a cooperation call with the clinic's telecommunications provider that Harker made in a tone that left no room for processing delays. Voss had been brought in and briefed. She'd stood in the conference room with her arms crossed and listened to Harker's summary with the expression of someone who was angry on behalf of 63 animals and was using procedural compliance as the container for it. Use whatever you need, Voss said. This building does not protect people who do what you're describing. She'd gone back to her afternoon appointments. The border collie with the fence injury needed sutures, and the world outside this hallway continued requiring attention regardless of what was happening inside it. Natalie sat at the front desk beside Jenny, who had been quietly moved to a secondary task in the back office. The phone in front of her was connected to the trace unit. Harker's note-taking agent was at the corner of the desk with headphones on, not looking at her, looking at his equipment, monitoring. Cole was in the doorway between the reception area and the corridor. Harker had told him twice to move further back. He had acknowledged both instructions and remained where he was. And Harker had made the calculation that removing him forcibly would cost more than it was worth and redirected her energy accordingly. Natalie hadn't told him to move. The phone rang at 4 minutes and 50 seconds, close enough to 5 minutes that Harwick had been watching a clock. She picked up on the second ring, not the first. First ring answered reads as waiting. Second ring reads as available, but not desperate. Iron Gate Veterinary. Natalie. His voice was what she'd expected. Measured. The professional warmth of a man who had spent years making difficult things sound reasonable. He was in his 50s, she remembered. A large man with the deliberate physical ease of someone who understood that size communicated authority and had learned to use it the same way he used his credentials. It's been a long time. It has, she said. Even. Giving him nothing. I imagine today's been a complicated day. I've had worse. A pause. She could hear him deciding how to frame the opening. I want you to know that I don't have any interest in making this harder for you than it needs to be. Whatever the investigators have told you about the scope of their inquiry, I think if we talk through the actual documentation, you'll see that what you've retained is more ambiguous than it might appear. Walk me through that, she said. Another pause. He hadn't expected the direct invitation. People who are trying to pressure someone expect resistance, pushback, the friction they can work against. Openness is harder to navigate. The 3 cases you flagged, he said, recovering. The clinical observations you documented. You were working with those animals in a recovery context. You saw them at a particular point in their rehabilitation. My team saw them at a different point, several months later in most cases. The discrepancy you identified isn't evidence of falsification. It's evidence of 2 different observation windows producing 2 different clinical pictures. Bravo, Natalie said. Silence. The shepherd that came in this morning, she said. The hip fracture. 12 to 18 months old, with periosteal remodeling consistent with chronic load bearing under an unrepaired structural failure. Your evaluation cleared him 14 months ago. She paused. What observation window explains that? The pause on his end was longer this time. When he spoke again, the professional warmth had thinned. That animal's case is more complex than a single imaging result. His handler's statement covers a 14-month timeline of behavioral and physical decline, she said. I have clinical imaging with Voss's dating attached. That's not ambiguous, Harwick. That's documentary. She kept her voice level, watching Harker's agent watching his equipment, watching the trace working, keeping him talking. You called me. You said I have your documentation. What documentation? The operational reports. He said it carefully. From the forward rotation. The cases that didn't make it into your formal submission. Because they weren't material. Because you chose not to include them. His voice had shifted now. Still controlled, but with an edge in it that was more honest than the warmth had been. Natalie, you were present for things during that rotation that would require a significant amount of explanation in a federal investigative context. I'm not threatening you. I'm pointing out that your decision to engage fully with this process has consequences for you that the investigators may not have fully outlined. Which specific operational reports are you referring to? Another pause. This one careful. He was deciding how specific to be, which meant he wasn't certain what she'd retained and what she hadn't. You know which ones, he said. Say it explicitly, she said, for clarity. Silence. Longer this time. She could hear him recalibrating. The agent at the desk corner had moved his hand and touched his earpiece and was looking at Harker with an expression that communicated something. Harker, standing 6 feet back, gave a small nod. They had him. Harwick, Natalie said, and the shift in her voice was subtle but complete. The professional neutrality she'd been maintaining giving way to something plainer. There are no operational reports that place me in a compromised position. You know that. You've spent 3 years hoping I'd be uncertain enough about my own record to believe there might be. She paused. There aren't. I know exactly what I did and what I documented and what I didn't, and none of it gives you anything. You're running a bluff on someone who knows every card on the table. The silence this time had a different quality. The investigators are going to find you, she said. The trace on this call is already complete. What they find when they get there depends on decisions you make in the next few hours. That's not me offering you anything. I'm not authorized to do that. It's just accurate. He disconnected. Harker was already on her phone before the click finished. The next 40 minutes operated on a different clock than the rest of the day had. The location hit came through 12 minutes after the call ended. A cell tower ping that placed Harwick in a motel 11 miles east of Harlow on the county road that ran toward the interstate. Not far. Not far at all, which meant either he'd moved slowly and hadn't planned this exit well, or he'd been close to begin with, and the proximity was intentional. Harker thought intentional. Cole agreed with Harker. Natalie said nothing, which was its own position. Local law enforcement was coordinated. Harker made 2 calls with the rapid-fire efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this exact sequence enough times that the words came out clean and complete without drafting. The county sheriff's office dispatched 2 vehicles. The federal team would follow. Clean handoff, established jurisdiction, no overlap complications. Cole watched all of this from the corridor with the particular quality of attention he brought to things he was not allowed to participate in directly. Natalie was at the nursing station. She'd returned there after the call the way she returned to all functional spaces in this building, because there was work to be done there, and doing work was how she metabolized situations she couldn't resolve by moving through them. She was updating Bravo's chart with the afternoon vitals the intern had taken, entering numbers with the same clinical precision she'd applied to everything else today, her handwriting the same size and angle it always was. Cole came and stood near the station. That was a calculated risk, he said, telling him the trace was complete before you knew if it was. It was complete, she said. You didn't know that when you said it. She looked up briefly. The agent touched his earpiece and Harker nodded. That's a location hit. I know what that sequence looks like. She looked back at the chart. It wasn't a bluff. It was early confirmation. He studied her. And the rest of it? The operational reports? You were certain he had nothing. Yes, completely certain. She set her pen down and looked at him directly. I spent 3 years going over every case I was present for, every decision I made, every document that passed through my hands. I did that because I knew that if this ever surfaced, the first move would be to come at my record. She held his eyes. I have nothing to hide. That's not the same as saying my record is uncomplicated. It's saying I know exactly what's in it, and none of it is what he needed it to be. Cole was quiet for a moment. You've been ready for this, he said. Not an accusation, closer to recognition. I've been prepared for this, she said. There's a difference. He nodded slowly. The clinic's front door opened and brought a gust of October cold with it. Two of Harker's team came back through from the vehicle outside, moving quickly, and went directly to the conference room. Down the hall, Bravo made a low sound from the kennel. The checking sound, the still here, still monitoring sound, and Cole's attention shifted automatically before he pulled it back. Go be with him, Natalie said. He's going to wake up disoriented from the medication. He needs a familiar voice. Cole looked at her. I'll find you when there's something to tell, she said. He went. Not because she'd told him to. She'd told him things all day and he'd chosen his own response to all of them, but because she was right, and because sometimes the most useful thing a person can do in a situation they can't control is go take care of the one thing they can. Harwick was in custody by 4:47 p.m. Harker relayed this to Natalie in 4 sentences in the corridor outside the conference room. No drama, no announcement, just information delivered with the same contained efficiency the woman had maintained throughout the entire day. 2 of the sheriff's deputies had made contact at the motel. Harwick had not resisted. Federal agents were en route to the location, and the formal processing would happen at the county facility pending jurisdictional confirmation. Natalie said, "Thank you." Harker looked at her for a moment with something that wasn't quite professional assessment and wasn't quite personal. "The documentation you retained," she said. "The 3 years you held that. It's the reason this investigation has a foundation." She paused. "Most people don't." "I know," Natalie said. "I want you to know we know that." Natalie looked at the wall, the heartworm prevention poster, the slightly wobbly corner where it hadn't quite adhered properly. These small, specific details of ordinary life that had surrounded this very large, very specific day. "There are 48 dogs still in placement," Natalie said. "We're working the list." "How fast?" "As fast as the system moves." Natalie looked at her. "The system moves at the speed of whoever's driving it. How fast are you moving it?" Harker held the look. Then, "As fast as I can, which is faster than you might expect." A pause. "We've already cross-referenced 12 placement addresses. Outreach begins tomorrow morning. Some of those animals may need immediate clinical intervention. I know, we have protocols for coordinating with the receiving veterinary facilities. If you need a clinical consultant, I'll call you," Harker said, and the way she said it indicated that she meant it, and that Natalie's transition in her estimation from witness to resource had become complete somewhere in the last several hours without either of them formally acknowledging it. Harker went back into the conference room. Natalie stood in the corridor. The afternoon light through the clinic's east windows had shifted to the low, amber quality of late October at 4-something in the Mountain Time Zone, the kind of light that makes ordinary spaces look briefly more significant than they are, before it fades and everything goes back to its actual dimensions. She should go check on Bravo. She should finish the chart update she'd started. She should call Voss and confirm the evidence preservation paperwork was fully completed and filed. There were 4 specific things she needed to do before the end of this shift, and she was running through them with the methodical habit of a person who maintains forward motion by converting overwhelming situations into discrete tasks. She was halfway through this list when the conference room door opened again. Not Harker this time. The agent who came out was the note-taker, the younger one, the one who had been running the records cross-reference on his laptop. He was holding the computer now, and he had the expression of a person who has found something they were not looking for and is in the process of deciding who needs to see it first. He found Natalie's eyes before he found Harker's door. "Oaks," he said. He stopped, looked at his screen, then back at her. Did you know there was a sixth case? She went still. What? We pulled the full Vantage Assessment Group contract records. You flagged 3 cases formally. The investigation team cross-referenced and found 3 additional discrepancies beyond your original submission. He turned the laptop toward her. But there's a 6th. It's not in the Vantage records. It predates the contract by 4 months. Different evaluator, same signature pattern on the clearance documentation. Natalie looked at the screen. Her face did something she couldn't completely control. That animal, the agent said, watching her. The clearance record shows a handler name. He paused. The handler name is yours. The name on the clearance record was hers, not her handwriting, not her signature. Her name, typed into the handler field of a pre-contract evaluation document that she had never seen, for an animal she did not recognize by the identification number in the record, processed 4 months before Vantage Assessment Group had any formal relationship with the military contracting system that had employed her. She looked at the screen for a long time. The agent, his name was Price, she'd finally registered it from his credential badge during the afternoon, stood with the laptop and watched her face with the careful attention of someone who has learned that what people don't say in these moments is as informative as what they do. That's not my case, she said. Your name is in the handler field. I know. That's not my case. She said it with the flat, specific certainty of someone who keeps precise internal records. I never handled an animal with that identification number. I can account for every animal that came through my hands during the transition period. I kept personal logs separate from the unit records. That number isn't in my logs. The document has a processing date of... I know what date it has. She straightened. Get Harker. Price went to the conference room door. Natalie looked at the screen again, not touching the laptop but reading everything on it with the methodical speed of someone extracting maximum information in minimum time. The clearance document was formatted identically to the legitimate Vantage assessments. Same column structure, same certification language, same signatory block. Except the signatory wasn't Harwick. The signature line had a different name, partially redacted in the digital record, with a federal case annotation number she didn't recognize, and her name in the handler field. Harker came out of the conference room. Natalie pointed at the screen. That document is fabricated. My name was inserted into a pre-existing record format. Look at the metadata on the digital file. The creation date and the modification date won't match. If the document was processed when it claims to have been, they should be the same timestamp. If it was modified later, we'd see a gap, Harker finished. She was already looking. She pulled a pair of glasses from her jacket pocket. Reading glasses, wire-framed, which she put on with the unself-conscious practicality of someone who'd stopped caring about what that looked like, and leaned toward the screen. A moment. Then she looked at Price. Pull the file properties. He had them up in 40 seconds. Creation date? 22 months ago, consistent with the document's claimed processing period. Modification date? 11 days ago. Harker took her glasses off. He built you a file, she said. Not to Price. To Natalie. He built me a file, Natalie agreed. Her voice was very controlled. 11 days ago, which means he knew or strongly suspected that the investigation was coming before your team made any formal contact. He had a contingency that predated today by over a week. She paused. Someone told him earlier than you thought. The corridor was quiet. If this had landed in an investigative record before I could contest it, Natalie said, it associates me with a fraudulent evaluation in the pre-contract period. It suggests I was part of the pattern before Vantage was even formalized. It doesn't just complicate my testimony, it makes me a subject instead of a witness. Harker's jaw had tightened. It poisons your credibility on the 3 legitimate cases you flagged. And the formal submission I filed 3 years ago becomes evidence of someone trying to redirect attention rather than evidence of someone trying to do the right thing. She said it without inflection, which was the only way she could say it without her voice doing something she didn't want it to do. Every piece of documentation I retained, every log, every record, all of it gets filtered through the question of whether I was covering my own involvement. She stopped. In the kennel room down the hall, Bravo made the low checking sound again. This is why he called, Natalie said. Not to negotiate, to find out whether I'd seen it yet, whether I knew it existed. She looked at Harker steadily. The phone call was reconnaissance. He wanted to know if I was scared, which would tell him whether I'd found the file, because if I'd found it, I would have had a reason to be scared. She paused. He misread me. Harker looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at Price. I need forensic document analysis on that file. Full metadata chain. And I need a contact at the Federal Archive, whoever processed the original Vantage contract, because if this document was inserted into the pre-contract records, someone with archive access was involved, and it wasn't Harwick doing it alone from a motel room 11 miles east of here. She was already moving. Price, get me everything on the redacted signatory. Everything. She went back into the conference room. The door didn't quite close behind her. It bounced on the frame, and through the gap, Natalie could hear Harker's voice shift immediately into the rapid clipped register of someone making calls that needed to happen right now. Price looked at Natalie. He was young, she realized, younger than she'd registered initially, somewhere in his late 20s. He had the slightly overwhelmed quality of someone operating at the edge of his experience and managing it by focusing very intently on the task immediately in front of him. Are you okay? He asked. It was such a direct, uncalculated question that it caught her without a prepared response. Ask me in an hour, she said. He nodded. Fair. She went to find Cole. He was on the floor of the kennel room where she'd left him, which was where she'd expected him to be. Bravo was awake, had been awake for a while, from the look of things, and was sitting up inside the kennel with his head pressed against the wire door and Cole's fingers threaded through the gaps, the two of them maintaining contact through the barrier in the way that bonded animals and their people do when physical closeness is what's available. Cole looked up when Natalie came in. He read something in her face before she said anything. What happened? She told him. All of it, straight through, no softening and no omission. She had learned in her professional life that unclear information transfer costs more than the discomfort of difficult information, and Cole had earned the complete picture. She watched his face move through the stages of understanding. The initial processing, the implication mapping, the point where it settled into something cold and specific. He built you a frame, Cole said. Yes. While he was still under contract, while the investigation was already being assembled. His voice had the texture of controlled anger, some not explosive but structural, something load-bearing. He had someone with archive access. This wasn't improvised. No. Who knew the investigation was coming 11 days ago? That's what Harker's running right now. She sat down on the stool in the corner. Her legs had decided to be honest about the day they'd had. The access logs on the archive will show who touched that record. It was a modification, not a creation. You can't entirely erase the trail on a modification. Forensic document analysis will find the gap between what the file claims to be and what it actually is. She paused. The question is how deep the network goes. Harwick wasn't operating alone. A contracted evaluator doesn't have federal archive access. Someone with institutional standing was in this with him. Cole was quiet for a moment. His hand moved absently against Bravo's muzzle through the kennel door. You said you've been prepared for this for 3 years, he said. The frame. Did you anticipate that specifically, or I anticipated that if this surfaced, the response would be to come at me? She looked at her hands. The specific mechanism? No. I didn't know about the document, but the logic of it, the move, yes. When someone is trying to protect something this size, the cleanest counter is to make the person exposing it look compromised. It's not creative. It's just effective. She looked up. Which is why I kept everything. Every log, every date, every note I ever made. If there was ever a question about my record, I wanted a record that answered it. Cole looked at her for a long moment. The phone number you had memorized. She nodded. You've been sitting in this town, working this clinic, carrying all of that. He said it quietly, not with pity. She would have shut that down immediately, and they both knew it. With something more like recognition of what a thing costs to carry. For 3 years. I had a job to do here, she said, and I wasn't wrong that the documentation would eventually matter. No, he said, you weren't. Bravo turned his head and looked at Natalie with the direct, calm attention of an animal that has decided someone belongs in its space. She reached forward and put 2 fingers through the kennel door. The shepherd pressed his nose against them, held for a moment, and then settled back down onto his good hip with a slow exhalation. "He's responding well to the pain management," she said, because she needed to say something that was about the work and not about the accumulated weight of the last several hours. "I know," Cole said. "I can tell." He watched his dog for a moment. He slept for almost 2 hours, real sleep, not the... He used to sleep with one eye open. Every surface in my apartment, I thought it was a habit. I thought it was the training. His voice had gone rougher. It was pain. He couldn't let go enough to actually sleep. She didn't say anything. 2 hours, Cole said again. The kennel room held that. Harker came to find Natalie 40 minutes later. She came alone, which was a different configuration than any of her previous corridor appearances. She closed the kennel room door behind her, which was another difference. She stood with her back against the door and looked at Natalie with an expression that had shed some of the contained professional affect and was operating on something more direct. "The forensic team confirmed the metadata gap," she said. 22-month creation, 11-day modification. The document is fabricated. Your name was inserted into a template built from legitimate Vantage formatting. They pulled the base structure from an actual cleared evaluation and overbuilt it. She paused. It's sophisticated enough that it would have survived initial review without forensic analysis. Someone knew what they were doing. "The redacted signatory," Natalie said. "We have a name." Harker's tone had changed. Slightly. "The archive modification was traced through an access credential belonging to a deputy contracting officer at the regional compliance office." She paused. "His name is Felton Reed." Cole made a sound. Small. Specific. Natalie looked at him. "Reed processed the original Vantage Assessment Group contract," Cole said. His voice was very careful. "I know that name. He ran the compliance review when Vantage was brought in during the transition period. He signed the approvals." He stopped. "He also signed my unit's transition documentation, the full retirement processing package, including Bravo's." The kennel room was very still. Harwick hadn't cleared Bravo alone. He'd cleared him with the institutional backing of a compliance officer who had both the authority to make that clearance stick and the archive access to modify records 11 days ago when the investigation started moving. 2 people. Possibly more. A network, not an individual. "Where's Reed, Mike?" Natalie asked. "Currently under federal hold at his office," Harker said. He was not warned in time. The archive access trace moved faster than whoever warned Harwick could communicate. A pause. "He cooperated immediately, which tells you something about what he thinks Harwick will do with the opportunity to make a deal first." "He's giving Harwick up," Cole said. "Comprehensively," Harker said. "In exchange for sentencing consideration. We're in the middle of that conversation right now." She looked at Natalie. "The document with your name, Reed confirmed it was Harwick's instruction. Reed built it using his archive access. Harwick provided the template." She paused. "There are 2 additional documents, similar construction, different names." She let that land for a moment. "Other former unit personnel who could have been witnesses. He built contingencies on multiple people." Natalie absorbed this. Other names. Other people who had perhaps carried their own quiet versions of what she'd been carrying, perhaps without the preparation. Perhaps without the logs and the memorized phone numbers and the 3 years of methodical readiness. People who might have looked at a fabricated document and found themselves unable to counter it with the completeness she could. "I need those names," she said. "The investigation will—" "I need those names," Natalie said again, and the quiet insistence in it was not aggressive, but it was immovable. If Harwick built contingencies on other former personnel, those people need to know the documents exist and what they look like. They can't defend against something they don't know is there. She held Harker's gaze. "I know how to reach people from that period. Channels that don't go through official records. If your outreach moves at the speed of federal process, the window between now and the first investigative subpoena is long enough for someone to get ahead of them." Harker studied her. You're asking me to let you make contact with potential witnesses, she said, before they're formally part of the investigative process. I'm asking you to let me tell people they have a problem and that there's documentation to counter it. She paused. That's not interference. That's damage control on a fraud that your investigation created the conditions for by moving, which is not a criticism. It's just the sequence. A long pause. I can give you the names, Harker said carefully. Officially, what you do with that information is outside my awareness. She paused. Unofficially, if you make contact and those individuals subsequently cooperate with the investigation, that's better for everyone's timeline. Yes, Natalie said. It is. Harker gave her the names. There were 3 of them. One was a former handler in her unit who had separated 8 months after Natalie, relocated to Colorado, and was currently working search and rescue. A man named Dex Farrow, who she knew, handled 2 animals through the Vantage transition period. One was a former logistics coordinator named Sarah Vant, who she'd kept loose contact with through a mutual acquaintance and who had moved into civilian contracting work in the Pacific Northwest. The third was a name she didn't recognize, a medic from a parallel unit who must have overlapped with the Vantage contract period without her direct awareness. She made the calls from the supply corridor, the same broken light corridor where she'd made the first call this morning, which felt like it belonged to a different week. Farrow picked up on the 3rd ring, heard the summary in under 3 minutes, and said, "I've got my own logs. I'll call you back in an hour." No drama. Just the particular efficiency of someone who has also, it turned out, been quietly waiting. Vant didn't pick up. Natalie left a message with enough specific information that she'd understand what it was and call back. The 3rd name, the medic, had a disconnected number. She flagged this for Price and let the investigative team run it through channels that could find current contact information faster than she could. When she came out of the supply corridor, the clinic had shifted into its late afternoon configuration. The last regular appointment of the day was being processed at the front desk. The overhead fluorescents in the main corridor had cycled into their evening brightness setting, slightly warmer, slightly less clinical. Jenny was shutting down her desk, and the intern was doing kennel rounds with the focused determination of someone who has had an extremely unusual day and has decided that cleaning water bowls is a restorative act. Voss was in the corridor. She was standing with her arms crossed and her reading glasses on her head, and the expression of someone who has been running a clinic through an extraordinary operational situation and is taking a moment to assess where things stand. She looked at Natalie with the direct diagnostic attention of a person who deals in physical realities. "You should eat something," Voss said. "You haven't since this morning." It was such a specific, practical observation, so entirely outside the register of everything the last several hours had contained, that Natalie stood with it for a moment. "I'm fine," she said. "That's not what I said." Voss's voice was not unkind. "There's food in the break room. Actual food, not just Marcus's energy drinks. Go eat. The federal agents are not leaving, and neither is the shepherd, and you being functional for the rest of this process is better for everyone, including the investigation." She paused. "Go." Natalie went. The break room was empty except for the bad coffee smell and a container of leftover soup that someone had brought in that morning and left in the refrigerator. She heated it without paying attention to what kind it was. Sat down at the table with the wobbly leg. Ate. Her hands were steady. They had been steady all day. She was aware of this with the same kind of awareness with which she registered her own heartbeat during difficult clinical procedures. Not reassurance, just information. The steadiness was not evidence that she was fine. It was evidence that she had trained herself not to shake in situations where shaking interfered with function. Those were different things. Cole appeared in the break room doorway. He looked at the soup. He looked at the chair across from her. He said, "Is there more of that?" "Check the fridge." He found a second container, heated it, sat down. They ate in silence for a few minutes, which was the most genuinely uncomplicated thing that had happened all day. "Farrow called back," Cole said. He had his phone in his hand. She hadn't heard it. "He asked me to tell you his logs cover both animals, complete timeline. He's contacting the investigation team directly." She looked at him. "He called you?" "He couldn't reach you." A pause. I gave him my number when you were in with Harker the second time, in case. He said it without elaboration, and she received it without making it into something larger than it was, because that was apparently how they were both operating today. Thank you, she said. He nodded. Outside the break room, footsteps in the corridor. Multiple sets, moving with the compact urgency of people who have somewhere to be. Harker's voice too low to distinguish words. Cole looked at the doorway. That sounds like a development. It does. Neither of them moved immediately. They sat with their soup in the break room with the wobbly table and the bad coffee smell, while the footsteps moved past and faded toward the front of the clinic. When this is over, Cole said. He stopped, started again. I mean, the formal part. The statements and the documentation and the... whatever the process looks like from here. He was looking at the table. What happens to you? I go back to work, Natalie said. Here. Here. She looked at him. This is my job. It was my job before today, and it'll be my job tomorrow. Bravo needs his evening vitals. The border collie from this afternoon needs a follow-up call. There's a feline dental case coming in Thursday that Marcus is already anxious about. She paused. The investigation is a thing that's happening. The clinic is where I work. Cole was quiet for a moment. You don't think about going back? To what? He held her gaze, an honest question, not a leading one. No, she said, and it came out clean, without the weight of a complicated decision. Just a fact that had already been settled, probably for longer than she'd consciously acknowledged. That part of my life ended. What I took from it... She stopped. This is what I took from it. He nodded, slowly. Price appeared in the break room doorway. He had the look he'd had when he brought her the laptop, the look of someone carrying information that needed to land in the right place quickly. Reed's full cooperation statement is in, he said. Harker needs you both in the conference room. He paused. There's something in the statement you need to hear before the formal briefing. Natalie set down her spoon. Cole pushed back from the table. They followed Price down the corridor toward the conference room where Harker was standing with the door open and the expression of someone who has received a complete picture and is deciding how to present the part of it that changes the shape of everything else. Natalie stepped through the door. Harker had the full Reed cooperation statement on the table, and next to it a secondary document, a financial record with a federal audit header pulled from Vantage Assessment Group's contracting files. It showed payment structures, disbursement schedules, invoicing records. And on the third page, highlighted in the way investigators highlight things they want you to see immediately, a recurring payment from a Vantage Assessment Group subsidiary account to a private consulting firm registered 18 months ago. The registered agent of that consulting firm was a name Natalie had never heard, but the beneficial owner listed in the registration filings, the person who actually controlled the account, was a name she had. She had seen it that morning on the authorization signature of a federal contract approval document in Harker's folder in the clinic's reception area when this day had still looked like it might be about one man and one compromised contract. The beneficial owner of the account receiving payments from Vantage Assessment Group was not Harwick. It was not Reed. It was the senior officer who had reviewed Natalie's original complaint 3 years ago, determined that the contractor's certifications were sufficient, and closed the file. The officer who had been her direct chain of command, the officer whose career had advanced significantly in the 3 years since. Natalie stood in the conference room of Iron Gate Veterinary Medical Center in Harlow, Montana, and looked at the name, and understood that the thing she had submitted to 3 years ago, the institutional wall, the closed file, the determination that her concerns were noted, had not been bureaucratic failure. It had been deliberate. It had been protected. And the person who had protected it had been receiving payment for doing so. The name on the document was Colonel Warren Stahl. Natalie had served under Stahl for 14 months during the Ford rotation period. She had submitted her formal complaint about the Vantage Assessment Group evaluations through his office. She had watched him review her documentation across a desk that had a framed unit citation on the wall behind it and a coffee mug from a university she couldn't remember. She had watched him tell her, in the measured language of institutional authority, that her concerns were noted and that the contractor's certifications were sufficient. She had thanked him, which was the part she remembered most clearly. She had thanked him for his time and walked out of his office and spent the following weeks understanding that the system she had trusted to correct itself had no intention of doing so. Stahl had advanced 2 grades since then. He was currently a senior contracting authority with oversight of multiple active assessment programs. His signature was on contracts. His clearance level gave him access to things that Reed had needed borrowed credentials to touch. He had been receiving payments from a Vantage subsidiary for at least 18 months of the period during which the fraudulent evaluations were conducted. Natalie looked at the financial record for a long time. Not with shock. Shock had somewhere to go, and this had nowhere to go, because the shape of it was something she had half known for 3 years without the ability to name it. The wall she had run into had felt too solid for individual failure. Institutional failures have a specific texture, and what she'd hit in Stahl's office had felt different, denser, more deliberate. She had been right about that, she just hadn't been able to prove it. Now someone else had. "When was this identified?" she asked. Her voice was very even. "Reed gave us the subsidiary account in the second hour of his cooperation statement," Harker said. "The beneficial ownership filing was public record, registered in a state with minimal disclosure requirements, but public. It took our financial analyst 40 minutes once we had the account number." She paused. "Reed said Stahl was the architect. Harwick ran the operational side, the evaluations, the falsified clearances. Reed provided contracting access and archive manipulation. Stahl provided institutional protection and, when necessary, the authority to bury incoming complaints." "Mine specifically," Natalie said. "Yours specifically." Reed confirmed there were 2 others that went through Stahl's office during the contract period. Both closed at the review stage. Both with the same determination language. She held Natalie's gaze. "You weren't the only one he shut down." Cole was standing behind Natalie. She could feel him processing this. The particular quality of stillness that was not passivity, but containment. The same thing she'd observed in him all day when something required him to hold anger in a form that didn't break things. "Where's Stahl now?" Cole asked. "Federal investigators contacted his office 40 minutes ago," Harker said. "He is currently being asked to make himself available for questioning." A careful pause. "Unlike Reed, he has not cooperated. He invoked legal representation immediately." "Of course he did," Cole said. Quiet, flat. "That's his right," Harker said. "It also tells us something about how prepared he was for this possibility. People who invoke counsel immediately in the first contact have usually thought about what the first contact would look like." She paused. His preparation didn't account for Reed, or for the document forensics, or for the financial trail. She looked at Natalie. Or for the fact that someone kept 3 years of documentation in a format that could be produced intact and authenticated within a single business day. Natalie absorbed this. "The fabricated document with my name," she said. "The beneficial ownership trail directly implicates Stahl in the obstruction. It's not just the original fraud, it's the active interference with an ongoing federal investigation. The archive modification happened 11 days ago, which puts it inside the current investigative period." "Yes," Harker said, "which upgrades the exposure significantly. What's the realistic timeline?" Harker was quiet for a moment, which was its own kind of answer. Federal processes move at the speed they move, and no one in this room had the authority to change that. "The evidentiary picture is strong. The cooperation from Reed is comprehensive. The document forensics are clean." She paused. "I'm not going to make you a promise I can't keep about how fast the institutional machinery moves on a case involving a senior officer, but I can tell you that the evidentiary picture we have tonight is the kind that doesn't get smaller over time." "It gets bigger," Natalie said, "because that was how these things worked when they finally broke open." The documentation she'd provided connected to the cases Dex Farrow was producing from Colorado, which connected to whatever the third name, the medic, would bring in once the investigators reached him. 63 animals, 3 dead from euthanasia decisions made without accurate medical history, 11 total gone. Handlers who had trusted the system, families who had taken in animals they were told were healthy. It was a very large structure that had been held together for a long time by Stahl's authority, Reed's access, and Harwick's willingness to sign things he knew were false. Now it was coming apart from every direction simultaneously. "I need to make a statement about Stahl specifically," Natalie said. "His direct role in closing my complaint, my interactions with him during the review period, everything I remember, in the sequence I remember it." She looked at Harker. "Tonight, if that's possible." "Tonight," Harker confirmed. "Price will set it up." The formal statement took 2 hours and 40 minutes. It was not dramatic in the way that things in this day had occasionally been dramatic. It was methodical and detailed, and frequently stopped while Price confirmed a date or cross-referenced a document number, and Natalie's voice stayed level throughout with the same consistency it had maintained since morning, and by the end of it there were 6 pages of typed transcript and a recorded audio file and a set of documentary exhibits that Harker's team had matched to Natalie's account point by point. When it was done, Natalie sat in the conference room for a moment after Harker and Price stepped out. The table still had its wobble. The chairs were still mismatched. The overhead light in this room had a faint flicker at the far end that nobody had noticed until the room got quiet enough to notice small things. She put her hands flat on the table and looked at them. 31 years old. A clinic in Harlow, Montana, with a kennel room that smelled of antiseptic and anxious animals, and the slow work of things being repaired. A record that was, as of tonight, fully visible and fully countered and attached to an investigation that was going to grow in the months ahead into something several sizes larger than what it had started as this morning. She thought about the version of herself that had walked out of Stahl's office 14 months into her service, carrying a closed file and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from work, but from understanding. That version of herself had known, with the specific clarity that angry and experienced people sometimes arrive at, that the documentation was the only thing she could control. She couldn't make the system correct. She couldn't make Stahl honest. She couldn't reach back through the chain and make the animals that had already been cleared and placed have the medical care they should have had. She could keep the records. She could be ready. She could wait for the moment when someone with more institutional reach than she had decided this mattered enough to pursue. And she could do her job in the meantime, not as a consolation, not as a retreat, but because the work itself was real, and the animals were real, and what happened in her hands on any given day. Bravo pressing his muzzle into her palm, the border collie with the fence injury holding still for sutures, the dozens of small, unremarkable acts of clinical care that filled the hours. That was real too, regardless of whether anyone in a position of authority acknowledged it. She had not been waiting to be seen. She had been waiting for the evidence to be enough. It was enough now. She got up from the table and went to check on her patient. Buzz. Bravo was standing in his kennel, not distressed, standing with the careful, exploratory quality of an animal testing its own weight, trying out what the body feels like when a significant portion of a long-running constant is removed. He was putting measured pressure on the left hindquarter and monitoring the result with the grave, systematic attention of a working animal running a self-diagnostic. Cole was on the floor watching him. "He's been doing this for about 20 minutes, Cole said. Just standing, shifting, like he doesn't quite believe it yet." Natalie crouched near the kennel. Bravo's eyes found her and held. She put 2 fingers through the wire, and he came to her again, the same as this morning, unhurried and certain. "He doesn't," she said. "It'll take a few days for his nervous system to recalibrate to the new baseline. He's been compensating so long that the absence of the compensation is its own kind of unfamiliar." She watched him. "He'll figure it out." Cole was quiet for a moment. "Stahl." "Yes. He's going to have lawyers." "He has lawyers right now," Natalie said. "He'll always have lawyers. That's not the same as having a viable defense against a financial trail, a full cooperation statement from his co-conspirator, forensic document evidence, and an authenticated original complaint from 3 years ago that proves he received and suppressed it." She paused. "Lawyers are more useful when the evidence is ambiguous. This isn't ambiguous." Cole looked at his hands. They were large hands scarred across the knuckles. In the way that hands get scarred when they've done physical work in difficult conditions for a long time. He turned them over once, like he was checking something. "He signed Bravo's retirement processing," Cole said. "The full package. If his signature is on the evaluation authorization chain, it will be reviewed as part of the investigation. If he had any direct role in approving Vantage's involvement in Bravo's specific case, that's additional exposure. She met Cole's eyes. Every record with his signature on it is going to be examined. That's going to take time, but it's going to happen. Cole nodded, slow. I keep thinking about what I would have done, he said, if I'd brought Bravo in 6 months ago, a year ago. He stopped. I almost did. In the spring. He was having a bad week and I almost brought him in, and then he rallied, and I thought... He looked at Bravo. I thought he was fine. He was managing, Natalie said. That's different from fine. But the difference isn't always visible from the outside, especially with animals that have been trained to make it invisible. She paused. And you brought him in today. That's the decision that's in front of us. Cole looked at her directly. Does that make it okay? No, she said, but it makes it the beginning of something better. She held his gaze. That's all any of us get, the next decision in front of us. He held that for a moment. Then something in his face loosened. Not collapsed, not broken, just released. The particular release of someone who has been holding themselves at operational tension for a long time and has arrived somewhere that doesn't require it. He needs a surgical consultation, he said. Thursday, if you can make it work. Voss has a specialist contact at the regional center who can see him this week. She reached through the wire and let Bravo make the decision about contact. He pressed into her hand. The surgical assessment will determine whether we're looking at repair or replacement. Either way, the rehabilitation is several months. It's not going to be fast. I know. He said it without resistance. Whatever it takes. She nodded. That was the right answer, and he knew it, and she knew it, and neither of them needed to make more of it than it was. Bam! Parker found Natalie at the nursing station at just past 8 p.m. The clinic was fully quiet now. The last staff member other than Natalie had left 40 minutes ago. The intern, who had stayed 2 hours past the end of his shift in the vague hope of understanding what he'd witnessed today, and had eventually been sent home by Voss with the instruction to be on time tomorrow and not to discuss the investigation with anyone, in that order. Parker sat down across the nursing station counter, which was not something she had done at any previous point during the day. The change in posture was small but notable, the difference between a federal investigator conducting a process and a person having a conversation. Stahl's legal team made contact with the investigative office at 7:43, she said. They've indicated he intends to provide a statement. She paused. Which is not the same as cooperation, and we all know it, but it means he's read the evidentiary picture and understands it's not manageable. He's going to try to minimize his role, Natalie said. Reed's statement makes that structurally very difficult. The financial trail makes it functionally impossible. Parker paused. He's going to face charges. The scope of those charges depends on what his statement contains and whether the investigative team finds additional documentation in his records, which they are currently in the process of obtaining with a warrant. She looked at Natalie steadily. He will not be in a position of institutional authority during or after this process. That part is certain, regardless of how the legal elements resolve. Natalie received this. She didn't celebrate it, not because she didn't feel anything, but because what she felt was too specific and too complicated to look like celebration. It looked more like the moment when you put down something heavy and your arms don't immediately know what to do with the absence of the weight. The 48 animals in placement, she said. How many have you reached? 17, as of this evening. Outreach will continue through the week. 5 of those cases have been referred for immediate veterinary assessment based on handler descriptions of recent behavioral and physical changes. Parker paused. We're coordinating with regional veterinary centers. If you're willing to serve as a clinical consultant on the assessment protocols, what to look for, how to approach evaluation for animals with strong handler bonds and potential pain masking, we'd like to formalize that. Natalie looked at her. Formally. Formally. With compensation and a proper consulting agreement and all the apparatus that implies. Parker's expression was about as close to dry as it got. The investigation has a budget for this, and you are, objectively, the most qualified person we've encountered in the last 12 hours. In the last 3 years, Natalie said. Not arrogance, just accuracy. Parker almost smiled. Yes. In the last 3 years. Natalie thought about it for exactly as long as it took to confirm what she already knew. Yes, she said. I'll do it. But Cole left at 9:30 after the evening vitals were logged and Bravo was resettled and the surgical consultation was confirmed for Thursday. He stood in the clinic's front doorway with his jacket on and the October cold coming through the gap, and he looked at Natalie in the way he'd been looking at her since the kennel room this morning, with that assessing quality that she'd originally read as calculation and had since understood was just his version of attention. He was a person who looked carefully at things. He'd looked carefully at her all day. I'll be back at 7, he said, for morning vitals. 7:15, she said. We don't start kennel rounds until 7:15. 7:15, he said. He left. She stood in the reception area for a moment after the door closed. The slightly crooked watercolor of the golden retriever was still hanging above the desk where it had always hung. She looked at it for a moment. I really looked at it, the way you look at something you've stopped seeing. It was actually not a bad painting. The light in it was specific and warm. Someone had cared about that painting when they made it. She straightened it. The news about Stahl broke publicly 11 days later, not in a gradual, contextless way. In the specific documented way that happens when a federal case has enough evidentiary weight that the initial press release doesn't require hedging language. Colonel Warren Stahl, former senior contracting authority, charged with fraud, obstruction, and abuse of authority in connection with a systematic scheme to falsify medical clearance records for retired military working animals over an 18-month period. 2 co-conspirators, a contracted evaluator and a deputy contracting officer, had already entered cooperation agreements with federal investigators. The Iron Gate Veterinary Medical Center in Harlow, Montana, was identified in the investigation documentation as the location where the initial clinical evidence had been developed and the original whistleblower complaint had been corroborated. Natalie read the press release on her phone during her lunch break. She read it twice, not because the information was complex, but because she wanted to hold it long enough to be certain it was real. Then she put her phone in her pocket and went back to the afternoon schedule, which included a follow-up call on the border collie, 2 vaccine appointments, and a geriatric cat with kidney function concerns that needed careful fluid management. Dex Farrow texted her that afternoon. 2 words. About time. She texted back. Yeah. Sarah Vant called the following morning. She had seen the coverage, had received her own contact from the federal investigators, and had found in her own records documentation she hadn't known to keep but had kept anyway, in the unexamined way people sometimes preserve things whose significance they can't yet name. She was shaken and angry, and underneath both of those, the particular complicated relief of someone who has been carrying a doubt about a thing they witnessed and has been told, finally, that the doubt was correct. Natalie talked to her for 40 minutes, not as a witness preparing for an investigation, just as a person who understood what it felt like to have known something true for a long time without being able to prove it. I kept thinking I was wrong, Vant said, that I didn't understand the process well enough, that there was some piece of the clearance system I was missing that explained what I'd seen. I know, Natalie said. It's easier to believe you don't understand than to believe the system is broken. Yes, Natalie said. It is. She paused. You weren't wrong. You didn't misunderstand. You were a person looking at something real and being told to look away. Vant was quiet for a moment. Does it feel like justice? She asked. Now that... She stopped. I don't even know what I'm asking. Natalie thought about it genuinely. Not the reflexive answer, not the clean response, but the actual answer. It feels like accountability, she said, which is the real thing. Justice is what you tell people to make accountability sound like it was always coming. Accountability is just the consequence arriving, eventually. She paused. It's not the same as the years. Nothing is. But it's real, and it changes what happens next for the animals that are still out there. That part matters. Yeah, Vant said. It does. Bravo's surgery was on a Thursday in mid-November. It went as well as surgeries go, which meant it went neither perfectly nor badly, but through the competent middle ground where skilled people do difficult technical work, and the outcome reflects that rather than reflecting anything magical. The orthopedic specialist at the regional center found additional cartilage deterioration that complicated the repair and extended the procedure by 40 minutes, which put Cole in the waiting area longer than anticipated, and left him in a state that he managed by drinking 3 cups of bad waiting room coffee and staring at a wall. When the specialist came out, she told him the repair was complete, the structural integrity was good, and that the recovery would take the better part of 5 months. Cole said, "Whatever it takes." He'd said that before. He still meant it. Natalie got the update by text during her afternoon shift. Between the geriatric cat's follow-up and a surprise laceration case involving a lab mix and what the owner described as a very aggressive kitchen drawer, she read Cole's message, "Surgery done." She said it went well. He's in recovery, and stood in the corridor for a moment with her phone in her hand. She typed back, "Good. Tell him easy." Then she went and dealt with the kitchen drawer situation, which required full concentration and a steady hand. Cole brought Bravo back to Irongate for his first formal rehabilitation assessment 6 weeks after the surgery. He came through the doors the same way he'd come through them the first time, with that contained, purposeful stride and the shepherd at his side. But the shepherd was different. Not entirely, not transformed in the way that stories sometimes imply transformation works, as though recovery is a switch rather than a slow renegotiation between a body and its new reality. But different in specific and observable ways. He walked with less compensation. The left haunch was carrying weight it had not carried in over a year, cautiously, and with the monitoring quality of an animal rebuilding trust in its own structural integrity. His eyes were not less alert. They would always be alert. That was wired in. That was who he was. But there was something underneath the alertness that hadn't been there 6 weeks ago. He was not in pain. That fact had a specific appearance, it turned out. You could see it if you knew what to look for. Natalie knew what to look for. She ran the assessment in exam room 2 with Voss present for the clinical documentation. Cole stood at the head of the table with one hand on Bravo's shoulder and watched Natalie work with the same quality of attention he had watched her with since the first morning. He'd stopped performing certainty around her sometime around the 3rd week of the post-surgical follow-up calls, when she'd told him that the recovery was progressing faster than projected, and he'd said, "That's because he's stubborn." And she'd said, "Where do you think he got it from?" And he'd not had an answer for that, which was apparently a new experience. "Range of motion is better than projected," she said, working through the hip assessment with the careful, systematic thoroughness that was just how she did things. "The scar tissue is forming cleanly. I want to add controlled incline work to the rehabilitation protocol starting next week. Short duration, monitored, building gradually." She glanced up at Cole. "No improvising. If he wants more distance, the answer is not yet." "Understood. I'm serious." "I know you're serious. I said I understood." Bravo turned his head and looked at Cole with the expression dogs produce when they are monitoring a human who is being gently managed by another human and find this interesting. "He's going to have good days and bad days," Natalie said, finishing the assessment and making her notes. "The structure is repaired. The muscle memory isn't fully rebuilt. There will be days where the leg is tired and he favors it, and you'll think something has gone wrong. It hasn't. It's just the body negotiating." She looked at Cole directly. "The negotiation is normal. Don't confuse normal difficulty with failure." Cole held her gaze. Something in the way she said it suggested she was not exclusively discussing the dog. "I know the difference," he said. "Good," she said. Bravo pressed his forehead against her arm. She put her hand on his head without looking down, the natural, unconsidered gesture of 2 individuals who have established an understanding. The formal commendation from the investigative office arrived at Irongate Veterinary Medical Center on a Tuesday in January. It came as a letter, actual paper, on federal letterhead, which felt appropriate for something that had involved 3 years of waiting and a very long October day. It recognized the clinic's role in the investigation and specifically named Natalie Oakes for her contribution to the evidentiary foundation of the case, her clinical documentation of Bravo's injuries, and her cooperation with and consultation support for the ongoing placement review process. Voss brought it to Natalie at the nursing station and set it in front of her without comment. Natalie read it, folded it, put it in her jacket pocket. "Thank you," she said. Voss looked at her for a moment with the direct diagnostic attention she brought to everything. Is that all it gets? What would you like it to get? Something, Voss said, not without warmth. You've been here 2 years. You work harder than anyone on this staff. You've managed a federal investigation from this nursing station while continuing to do your actual job, and now you're going to put the recognition in your pocket. She paused. It's allowed to mean something, Natalie. Natalie looked at the pocket where she'd put the letter. It means something, she said. I'm just not good at showing that. I know, Voss said. It would be more concerning if you suddenly were. She started to go, then stopped. Stahl is going to plead, according to whatever you're allowed to tell me. The legal process is ongoing, Natalie said, which was the official answer. The legal process is ongoing, Voss repeated with the tone of a person who has received the official answer and assessed it appropriately. Good. And she went back to her afternoon. Later, in the break room, Natalie took the letter out of her pocket and read it again. It was not an extraordinary document. The language was formal and careful and did not fully capture the shape of what the day had been or what the 3 years before it had required. Letters rarely do. They operate at the level of the official record, and the official record is always a reduction of the actual experience. The condensed documentary version of something that was, in the living of it, considerably more complicated and considerably more human. But it set her name in connection with the right things. It said she had been right. Not in those words. Bureaucratic documents rarely say anyone was right, because being right implies someone else was wrong, and wrong implies accountability, and accountability is the word everyone uses and the thing everyone avoids. But between the formal language and the specific citations, the meaning was there. The documentation she had kept and the clinical observations she had made and the 3 years she had spent in this clinic doing the work that was in front of her, all of it had mattered. All of it had contributed to something that was now permanently part of the record. 48 dogs in placement, being seen by veterinarians who now had accurate medical histories. 11 animals already gone, who at minimum had their suffering documented and attributed and connected to consequences. 63 cases that had been hidden and were hidden no longer. And bravo, learning to walk without pain. She folded the letter again and thought about what Vant had asked her. Does it feel like justice? She still thought the answer was accountability, not justice. Justice was a cleaner word than what this actually was. What it actually was the slow, imperfect human work of a system finally functioning in the direction it was supposed to function after a long period of being deliberately aimed elsewhere by people who had decided their interests outweighed everyone else's. That wasn't justice in the grand sense. That was just the machinery finally catching up. But the animals that would be accurately assessed from this point forward, because the protocols had been reviewed and the contracting oversight had been strengthened, they would have a better reality than the 63 had. And someone who kept records and did their job and waited for the evidence to be enough had been part of making that happen. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, almost everything. She put the letter in her bag and finished her coffee and went back to work. The last appointment of that Tuesday was a retired police dog, a Belgian Malinois named Hex, 9 years old, recently placed with a family after a full career in narcotics detection. His new family had brought him in for a general wellness check. Nothing urgent, they said. They just wanted to make sure he was okay. Natalie brought Hex into exam room 3 and did the assessment the same way she did every assessment, systematically, carefully, without making assumptions. She ran her hands along his spine, checked his joints, assessed his gait on the clinic floor, watched his eyes and his posture and the way he distributed his weight. He was in reasonable shape for his age, with the beginning of some stiffness in his rear hips that was worth monitoring and a small irregularity in his left carpal joint that she wanted imaging on before she could characterize it fully. She told the family this directly, with the same clinical precision she always used, and watched them receive it with the particular quality of attention that people give information about animals they have recently decided to love. "Is he okay?" the youngest family member asked. He was about 8, sitting on the bench along the wall with his sneakers not quite reaching the floor. Natalie looked at Hex, who was sitting with the excellent posture of a formally trained animal and looking at the boy with a calm and steady attention. "He needs some follow-up," she said, "but he's doing well. He just needs someone to pay attention to him." She paused. "You'll be good at that." The boy looked at the dog with the complete seriousness of an 8-year-old understanding that he has been given a responsibility. "I will," he said. Natalie believed him. She wrote up the assessment notes, scheduled the follow-up imaging, and walked the family out through the reception area where the golden retriever painting hung straight on the wall. She held the front door for them as they left into the January cold, Hex moving at the boy's side with the careful, dignified pace of an animal that has worked hard for a long time and is learning, incrementally, what it means to simply be somewhere and belong there. She stood in the doorway for a moment after they'd gone. The parking lot of Iron Gate Veterinary Medical Center in Harlow, Montana was exactly what it had always been. A strip of cold asphalt with a painted line that nobody quite followed and a streetlight that came on unevenly. The mountains were present in the distance the way they were always present, indifferent and enormous, and entirely unimpressed with anything that happened at human scale. She had come here because she needed somewhere to be while she waited. She had stayed because the waiting had become the work, and the work had become the thing she was most fully herself in, and at some point those two things had become indistinguishable from each other. She had not been waiting to be saved. She had not been waiting for someone to see her value and grant her recognition and transform her circumstance through the application of institutional grace. She had been waiting for the evidence to be sufficient. She had been building the case, quietly, over 3 years, in the margins of every shift and every assessment, and every small, methodical act of clinical care. And when the day came, not because she had summoned it, not because she had forced it, but because she had kept herself ready and kept the records and kept doing the work, she had been prepared for it in a way that made everything that followed possible. That was not a story about being seen. That was a story about refusing to disappear. She went back inside, let the door close behind her, and started the evening notes.